Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name's Brittnee. Today's chocolate bonbon filling is cherry cordials. This video was really fun for me because the bonbon flavor and the techniques used to make it are all new to me, and so I really learned a lot. Have you ever wondered how that cherry syrup gets into the chocolate in a cherry cordial? You know, it's possible to mold liquid fillings, but then what about the cherry cordials that are like a whole cherry with the stem still on them? Those would have to be dipped, right? But you can't dip a liquid. Well, if you aren't already familiar with how this candy is made, you might be surprised to find out that the cherry syrup actually starts out as fondant. Yep, you heard that right. Fondant, as the cake boss would say.
Fondant, 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 in all the fondants get fondant, 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 fondant.
When I learned this, the first thing I thought of was rolled fondant. And it's kind of the same thing, but not exactly. They're similar things, but they are different. Don't quote me on this, but I think that all different types of fondants originated from the same type of fondant, the original version, the classic way that it's made. But then as time went on, different ways of making it were created. Let's pull out the old pastry textbook, shall we? In here, in the glossary, it says, fondant, a type of icing made of boiled sugar syrup that is agitated so it crystallizes into a mass of extremely small white crystals. So that's the official definition by Professional Baking 6th edition Wayne Gislin. I do remember making that kind of fondant in pastry school because we used it to glaze some petit fours. So I am familiar with that kind, but I haven't made it in probably 10 years. But anyway, fondant can be used for lots of different things. Traditionally, it was used as a glaze, like what you would see on a Napoleon. It can also be used as a chocolate or pastry or cake filling, a cake or pastry coating, and then it can also be made in a way that you can roll it out and cover cakes in it. And it's also used to make cherry cordials. And as far as I can tell, doing research for this video, you can use any kind of fondant to make the cherry cordials. I've seen videos where people use the traditional fondant method, where you cook and crystallize the sugar. But I also saw someone making it with the marshmallow kind of fondant recipe, which is the rolled kind of fondant. It's like an easy way to make it, but I've never had success with that. I don't recommend it, but and then I also read a recipe online that uses rolled fondant to make the cherry cordials. So I don't know how well all of these will turn out. I'm just saying you could experiment. But I think the most important thing is that all of the fondant recipes have one thing in common, which is a ton of sugar. Anyway, you may still be wondering how the fondant magically turns into cherry syrup. And it's all thanks to an enzyme called invertase. Now this is something you'll have to add into the fondant right before you make the chocolates. The invertase breaks down the sugars in the fondant and turns it into a nice smooth syrup. Today, I will be using the traditional method to make the fondant, but I have adjusted it a little bit to be a bit more fluid, since my end goal today is to be able to pipe it into a molded chocolate. All right, sorry for the long intro. I found this whole process to be really interesting, but let's get started. Here are the supplies that you'll need. Castor sugar. This is just super fine sugar, which dissolves and incorporates quicker when heated. Maraschino cherries in syrup. Glucose. Some almond extract. Invertase. You can order this on Amazon, and I've linked it down below. Some non-stick cooking spray, a pastry brush, a small pan. I'm using a 1/4 sheet tray, a nice pot with a heavy base. This helps distribute heat evenly and is great when cooking sugar, and a stand mixer with a paddle attachment. The first thing that we'll do is prepare each ingredient. Go ahead and weigh out 16 ounces of sugar, then weigh out 4 ounces of water, Now grab a jar of the maraschino cherries and drain the syrup from them. The cherries need to be dry for when we mold or dip them, so I just put them into a container with a couple paper towels laid down on the bottom. Seal it with a lid and store them in the fridge for now. Now measure out 4 ounces of the strained cherry syrup. Measure 3.5 ounces of glucose. And prepare your small sheet tray by spraying it with a thin layer of non-stick cooking spray. Now go ahead and place your pan on the stove and turn the heat on to high, then pour the caster sugar into the center of the pot. Then you'll add the water and the cherry syrup. I like to kind of pour them around the edges of the sugar to help keep the sides of the pan clean. Then I fill up my little pitcher with hot water and use my pastry brush throughout the process to clean the edges of the pan to prevent crystallizing the sugar as I heat the mixture. As the mixture is warming up, you can feel free to stir it with a high heat spatula. When you're stirring, just always be careful to not knock any crystals up onto the edge of the pan and be diligent with keeping the edges clean using the pastry brush and water. So the first step is to bring the mix to a boil to ensure all the sugar crystals are dissolved. Once it's boiling and about 105 degrees Celsius or 221 degrees Fahrenheit, go ahead and add in the glucose. You can give a little stir to distribute the glucose, but try to stay in the center of the pot. Now just continue cooking the fondant until it reaches about 113 degrees Celsius or 235 degrees Fahrenheit. Something important to talk about here is that the temperature you need to cook the sugar to will vary depending on the altitude where you live and also your desired thickness. I'm staying on the lower end of the temperature range because I want my fondant to be fluid and pipeable so that I can make molded cherry cordials. If you want to only do dipped cordials, you may want to heat this a bit longer and even consider decreasing some of the water so that you'll have a thicker finished fondant. So once the mix reaches 113 degrees Celsius or 235 degrees Fahrenheit, immediately pour it onto your sheet tray. This is going to help us quickly cool the mixture and it will also help it cool evenly. Now I place my thermometer into the fondant, which will help me measure the temperature as it's cooling without continuously disturbing it by poking into it. Now you want to cool it to under 50 degrees Celsius or 122 degrees Fahrenheit. My sugar cooled really fast, and by the time I checked it, it was already down to 40 degrees Celsius, so it's ready to go. I checked a couple different spots in the pan to make sure it was cooling evenly, but the pan does a great job to cool everything evenly, so you don't have to check multiple spots like I did. Now, just pour all the sugar straight into your mixing bowl. And the next step is to recrystallize the sugar to create really fine small crystals, and we do that by agitating it. So with the paddle attachment, turn your mixer onto medium speed. The whole process shouldn't take longer than 12 minutes, so I will show you what the fondant looks like after every 2 minutes. Here's what it looks like after 2 minutes. You'll notice it has already gone from darker red and translucent to more pink and opaque. This is the sugar recrystallizing. Here's what it looks like after 4 minutes. This is after 6 minutes. Here it is after 8 minutes. And this is after 10 minutes. You'll notice after each time the fondant got a little thicker and more opaque. Once it looks about like this, it's ready. Now I move the fondant to an airtight container to rest a bit while I prepare the cherries. And the fondant can be stored just like this in the fridge for a while and used at a later time as well. Now I grab the cherries that were stored in the fridge, and I'm going to first make sure they're dry on a new paper towel. Now I'm going to sort the cherries because I am going to be molding some of them, and I also wanted to dip some of them just to show you how, in case you want to know how to do both. For the molded cherries, I take off the stem, and for the dip cherries, I keep the stem on. So now the fondant has cooled down a bit, but I need it to be more fluid to add in the flavor and the Invertase. So I'm going to gently warm it in the microwave on a low power. You can also do this over a water bath. And just for reference, here is what the temperature is now. Now I add in 1/4 teaspoon of almond extract, which just pairs well with cherry and adds another layer of flavor. Then I add in 1 teaspoon of Invertase. Now remember, the Invertase is what breaks down the sugar into a syrup. So if you make your fondant in advance and dip or mold your cherries a couple days later, be sure to do this step right before making the cherries. Don't add this before storing the fondant in the fridge, because once it's added, it starts to work. So the fondant has to be pretty fluid in order to dip the cherries, so I'm going to do those ones first. You basically just grab one from the stem and dip it into the fondant until the whole cherry is covered, then scrape off the excess and place the cherry on a pan. Earlier, I mentioned that this recipe is formulated for molded cherry cordials. So you will see how after I dip the cherries, the fondant settles a lot more than I'd normally want it to. So what I did to get it to still work okay with this more fluid fondant is that I just dip a handful of them and pop them into the freezer in between. Then I dip more on a different pan and pop those into the freezer, and then I just swap between pans to keep the fondant cool and more solid. And another thing to note, you'll see throughout the process that I swap out the parchment paper to just use a greased pan instead. I recommend using a small pan sprayed with nonstick spray. The sticky fondant peels off of that a lot easier than the parchment paper. And now for the molded cherries. I realized that the cherries were actually just a bit too large for my mold that I used. Of course, if you use a different one, you may have enough room for the full cherry. But what I did is just cut the cherries in half and lay them curved side down. Now I'll move the rest of the fondant into a disposable piping bag so it can cool down. For molded bonbons, we need to pipe any filling around 28 to 29 degrees Celsius or 82 to 84 degrees Fahrenheit. To pipe the fondant into the cavity, I make sure to go around the outside of the mold, around the cherry, and then also fill in the center of the cherry. And then I just fill up the rest of the mold, leaving around 1/8 of an inch at the top for capping. I wanted to make sure to get the fondant around the edges of the cherry so that as it settles, it would fall down and fill in any gaps underneath. And then the fondant is pretty sticky and thick, so to get a clean pipe, it helps to quickly tap it against the filling and quickly pull it up to break the sticky strand apart. And while I tempered some milk chocolate, I let the fondant filling sit and settle, and you will see some air bubbles come up to the surface. So every so often, I just took a needle tool and popped them. Now to finish the dipped cherries, I have a small bowl of tempered milk chocolate, and it's important that all the cherry cordials have a really clean and tight shell and seal, because once the fondant turns to syrup, they can leak, and we don't want that. So first I dip just the bottoms of each cherry, and then I go back and dip the full cherry. And when I dip the whole cherry, I make sure to go all the way into the chocolate up to the stem to really seal everything in. To finish the molded cherries, I cap them just like I would cap any other molded chocolate, but I saw a couple popping through, so I did a second round. There were still a couple popping through even after that, but I just added a little chocolate directly to those ones with an offset spatula, being careful to keep each cavity edge clean for unmolding. And after 30 minutes in the fridge, I carefully unmold the cherry cordial bonbons. So the final important thing you need to know about cherry cordials is that the invertase takes a little bit of time to work. The cherry cordials with just the fondant are still delicious to eat right away, but if you want the cherry to be surrounded by only syrup, you will need to wait at least a couple of days, if not a little over a week. It will depend on what temperature you store them at and how much fondant you can fit into your mold. The cooler you store them, the slower they'll turn into syrup. And it can also take longer to develop the syrup the more you start with. And just to give you a little bit of an idea on the timeline, I cut open some cordials over about 2 weeks to show you how the inside progressed. This is after 2 days. You can tell the fondant is being broken down and it's getting a little juicy. This is after 9 days. I should have done another one in between 2 and 9 days, but I didn't think it would already be so juicy. I was impressed at the juice basically being done after just 9 days. This is after 10 days. I wanted to also show you how the molded ones were coming along. And this is after 15 days. And you can see both types of cordials are really juicy and fully ready to eat. All right, guys, that is the magic behind cherry cordials. I hope that you enjoyed today's video and that you learned something new. If you liked it, please let me know by liking it and leaving me a comment down below. If you haven't subscribed to my channel yet, today's the day. If you'd like to see something else that sweet, just click on one of these thumbnails. Thanks so much for watching today, and I'll see you soon. Bye.